Well, I got some comments last week of others who watched the Bible study. What was going on with that group? You know, you were fixing the glasses. Oh, it was so funny. So funny. People asking, you all have a good time, don't you? I think it's one of the reasons that we did that meal at the end of the lessons last year in May. I really wish you all could get to know each other. You should visit the other ones. Just show up and as they say, be a fly on the wall or something. But every group is so different. But they're all so good. We just enjoy each other so much. I learn a lot, from things that you all have read, and as we said last time, a totally different way of looking at chapter 15 that I hadn't even thought about. So there's a lot that we learn from each other as we go through this. Before we begin, I'll say this for the sake of those watching online, there'll be no Bible study next week because of the election. Some of us I'm not sure if I'll be babysitting or not. I probably won't know till Monday night. So, but anyway, so there'll be no school that day, so we'll have no Bible study next week. So.
That's too bad. Because I remember growing up, election day.
Yeah.
At school.
Yeah, we had school.
Yeah.
I mean, I
thought it was a great,
I went to Riverdale and they voted in the gym at Riverdale, and we had school right on it. But then, all these strange people coming into the school, they can't have that. So.
Well, but it's good education for
It is just a good civic education, governmental education. That's right. But they didn't ask me.
No, they never ask us, do they?
No, they never ask us. So. Okay, so as I've told you, as we've gone along, chapter 14 was one of my favorite chapters in the Old Testament. Chapter 15 intimidated me. And now chapter 17, out of all the chapters that we've studied, has perplexed me the most. And the reason for that is so many things are repeated so many times. And God telling Abram, whose name is now changed to Abraham, telling you point blank, since obviously they hadn't got the message before, that Sarah will be the mother of the child of promise. But then what really perplexes me about it is when we get to chapter 18, basically the same thing happens again. And I know that's what it looks like. Of course, I've not studied 18 yet. I've not looked at the words. I've not looked at exactly what it said, but I know the Lord and two other men who we know are angels show up at Abraham's house, at his tent, and tell him that, by this time next year, Sarah's going to have a child or have a son. And, did Abraham not tell her that this happened in chapter 17? Is she hearing it then for the first time? I don't know. We'll find out there when we get to chapter 18. But then, like I said, in verses 1 through 15 of chapter 18, they essentially say all this over again. And so there's all of that without even delving into circumcision. So that's where I started from in my studies this week. What about you? Where did you start and where did you go with it?
Well, I read the chapter, and then I read the chapter again in a different Bible.
Yeah.
And then I took out your questions, and I started going through the questions. Then I went and listened to some sermons.
Good.
So.
Well, if you got anything to add from what you've heard on the sermons, please share it.
Sure.
So there's a lot we could go into as far as tying the circumcision in with what's said in the New Testament that we really not going to have time to do that. I mean, that would make a great study in itself. But, certainly as much as we can cover, we want to do that. Anybody else?
I was thinking, because I had both my boys circumcised when they were first born, and they cried, and I felt like the worst mom in the world to have to do that to them.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, don't do it. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And so I can't imagine imagine grown men
99 years old.
being circumcised.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
hard to imagine.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
A lot of pain medication.
I don't think they had it.
Not
Sure.
that. No, you're right.
Well, they may have had, the natural remedies that they knew how to use, so that we don't know. But
Wasn't there someplace that was it Abraham and Isaac? That circumcised like a whole group of men and Abraham.
well, that's here, but we'll talk about that. But that's in Joshua.
Okay. Yeah.
In Joshua, 2 different places in Joshua that happens.
I think there's a lot of moaning.
Moaning and groaning. Now remember, I told them Tuesday morning, I said, I tried to keep it G-rated last week, since we were recording. So we remember we're recording. This is a live stream. So, but here's the thing. We are adults. Even if there may be some men watching the live stream, we are adults. And this is in Scripture, and this is life. I mean, this is not something to be joked about, to be embarrassed about. It is truly something to be understood. And so that's where we are in this lesson. So, anything else? What else?
The other thing that I was just wondering, curious about, was that Ishmael fathered the 12 sons that were leaders. Was that just one wife? Was that
Probably.
multiple wives?
We don't know. Let me look here right quick. That's chapter 25.
And then, did God only give him sons, or were there daughters mixed in there too? So there was actually more births than 12?
All we have on that is in chapter 25, beginning with verse 12. This is the Toledot. These are the records of the generations of Ishmael, Abram's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maid, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons, and there's 12 of them, 12 sons. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages, by their camps. 12 princes, P-R-I-N-C-E, princes according to their tribes. And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and was gathered to his people. And they settled from Havilah to Shur. Remember, that's where she went as she was getting away, which is east of Egypt as one goes toward Assyria. And he settled in defiance of all his relatives. That's all we know about him. We don't know if there were daughters. We don't know. Now remember this, as we've talked about, the river of humanity and this tributary that comes off, and from that point on, from chapter 12 on, the entire Bible, all the way up until the time of Paul, is only about Abraham and his descendants with their occasional interaction with others. But the only thing that's said about anybody else is what takes place within the interaction with Abraham. From that, if it goes further than that, we don't know. So we don't know anything else about Ishmael. We don't know if there were daughters. We don't know if he was married more than once. And I'm not sure, unless there's something between here and chapter 25, but I don't think we even know his wife's name. In chapter, I believe it's 21, when Isaac is being weaned, and Ishmael's making fun of him. My mother used to always say, Ishmael made fun of Isaac when they were little ones, and they've been fighting ever since. But he made fun of him because he was just I don't know how old he was, it doesn't say, but he was just then being weaned. And so, of course, Sarah got mad, told Abraham, going to have to do something about this. And so Abraham then is the one who sends Hagar and Ishmael away, sends them with food and water. There's the whole bit, and, she goes and runs out of water, and the angel of the Lord speaks to her again. But at the end of that, it says, she takes Ishmael to Egypt and got him a wife. That's all we know. So we don't know if he was married to more than one. It's just that his wife came from Egypt, from that polytheistic culture.
So he was circumcised.
Yes. And Arabs are today too. So, yeah, all the descendants of Abraham are.
It's kind of like Ishmael or the Arabs they had like 12 tribal settlements, and then the Israelites had 12.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they have both got.
Yeah, God gave that to both of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts on reading? I'm going to get me a bottle of water and step out of the camera just a
Is
second.
this the first time anybody was circumcised?
That's a good question.
I wonder, just to think God told him to do it. Well,
It is
heard of it before.
It's the first time, and we'll get into that more when we get there, but it's the first time it's mentioned in Scripture. But there are differences of opinion in the commentaries as to whether this was the first time it was done or whether this was something that was done in other cultures or in other peoples, but God appropriated it for his purpose. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that point.
Well, it was done so they'd be identified with.
Yes, it would. Yeah, so that Abraham's descendants would be identified with the covenant. Yeah.
That's right. I remember how you talked everybody into just come on.
This is it. We'll see how he got around that.
Okay.
Get there. Other thoughts?
Well, at that last overview studies, you said, how would you summarize this chapter? And I just thought, ouch.
Title this chapter, ouch. Yeah, that's a good summary of the chapter. All right, on that note.
Let's dive in.
Let's
get our knives ready.
Yeah. All right, well, let's just jump in and you share what you've read and, for questions or so forth. But as chapter 16 ends, it says, and Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. And chapter 17 begins, now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. So that immediately tells us that it's been 13 years. 13 years since between these two events. So think about this. What had those 13 years been like? Hagar came back. They had the child. We don't have any details of what home life was like. But regardless of the dysfunction that had to have been there, just going on what we know about life with a child. Just think about, don't even think about the dynamic that was going on between Hagar and Sarai and Abram. Just think about life with a child from baby to teenager. It doesn't take long until you settle into some kind of a routine. Even with dysfunction, you settle into some kind of a day-to-day routine. As I was thinking about this, I thought about our son Joe Jr., his two kids, ages 11 and 2. Joe Jr., when you ask him how things are going, he just says, it's Groundhog Day. Same thing, every day, over and over. And then John, our other son, his two are 9 and 7. When I ask him how things are going, he may say, well, I start to say fix supper, but no, it's dinner. They fix dinner. But get bath, go to bed, get up, do it all over again. That's what he says. As the saying goes, the days are long, but the years are short. So, but for me, I've often said that the time span between my 40th birthday and my 50th birthday is just a blur. I don't even remember what went on at that time. I was caring for my parents and Joe's parents and 2 boys in middle school and then high school, and I owned a business. I mean, it was just a day-to-day routine, Groundhog Day indeed. And for Abram and his family, I imagine it was much the same. They settled into a routine. The baby, at least now you would think, at least there's the 2 of the women that can swap out duties maybe. One of them can get some sleep at some time. But we don't know how long before the events of chapter 16, what we talked about last time, that the events of chapter 15 happened. 15, when God appeared, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, and all of that, and this covenant that was laid out. And then 16 with Hagar, we don't know how long it was between those 2 chapters. Likely not very long. So now as we come to chapter 17, it's been around 13 to 14 years. I mean, she carried him for 9 months. That's the better part of a year. And then the 13 years between that. So, but it's been around 13 or 14 years since Abram has heard from the Lord. This is likely the longest time span between encounters with the Lord that he has experienced. We don't know how long it was between Abram's original call in Ur until he finally left for Haran, and then when he finally left Haran and came to the Promised Land. But we know that when he came to Canaan, he was 75 years old. We know from Genesis 12, verse 7, that once he arrived in Canaan, the Lord appeared to him and promised him this land. After that fiasco of going down to Egypt, once he returned from there, he repented for his failure to trust. And then after Lot left, God spoke to him again. There was a time span. And said that all of the land would be his, not only his, but his descendants after him forever. The word was olam, and the word olam means to the vanishing point. Remember that, because that'll come up in this chapter. Forever, to the vanishing point. Sometime after that, likely not very long, we have the war of chapter 14. Then immediately after that, God appeared to Abram, encouraging him again, reckoned him as righteous, and allowed him to see God himself ratify and confirm that covenant. The covenant had been made back in chapter 12. But now Abram says, I need to see something. Well, give me something concrete that I can see. And so God, as one teacher said, God condescended to do this with these animals. This was something that Abram would have known well. As we said, God spoke in Abram's language when he did that. Abram had probably seen this take place many times before, if not participated in covenants like this before. So God did this for Abram, allow him to understand that this is a solid something that you can hold on to. But they'd been 10 years in the land at that time, and there was still no child. And so then Abram, as Sarai, out of desperation, I think, decided that God expected them to do something. Last week in all 3 groups, I put out my proposal of this different way of looking at this chapter, and I just see them as weak, flawed human beings. I don't see them as devious. I don't see them as trying to get around God. I don't see Abram as being a weak man. I see him as being a man that loved his wife very much. He had never, although it was the law of the land, he had never even suggested to her that she ought to do that. I admire him more than ever for that, because I'd never seen that before. It was fully acceptable in that culture, and I don't think he'd ever even hinted at taking that solution before. But I think they decided that God expected them to do something. Have you ever heard the old saying, God can't steer a parked car? People will use it. Well, I had to do something. No. You didn't. God can't steer a parked car. Don't have anything to do with it. God could if he wanted to. He could make it move if he wanted to. God's plan will work out when God wants it to. But they did that. And Hagar had the child. And think about this. At no time in chapter 16 did we see God ever come to Abram and Sarai and say, no, you got it all wrong. God never says anything. After he speaks to Hagar, there is no word from God. But sadly, I think they knew that they did. And I think maybe that Abram, at this point, as chapter 17 begins, I think Abram was at his lowest point ever. Maybe even lower than being run out of Egypt. You know, as the saying goes, run out on a rail. Even lower than he was then. He is out of fellowship with God. Maybe he feels that his prayers are going no higher than the ceiling. You ever felt that way? If you haven't, you're lying. There had been no word from God now for 14 years. I mean, again, this is real. 14 years. Had he given up hope of ever hearing from God again? Did he think he'd blown it for good? Did he think that because of what they'd done, that Ishmael would indeed now be the heir of the promise? And I'd really never thought about this. I went back and read 17 again, and there's no reason for him not to think that Ishmael's going to be the son of promise, because God's not spoken to him anymore. It's like, well, there you go. You've got Ishmael. That's all you're going to get. We don't know. It certainly looks that way. And then one day, God came back. And Abram and Sarai may have forgotten the covenant in the busyness of life, but God had not forgotten. And remember, as we said last time, timing is everything. So verse 1 says, now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. And here we have another new title for God. And I gave you that sheet last week. Everybody here got one of those last week, didn't you? Okay. We talked about the titles for God. God Almighty. This is El Shaddai. Anytime you have a word in Hebrew that has two consonants, double consonant, the emphasis is on the second part. Like Betty would be Betty. Yeah, it's El Shaddai is how it's pronounced, or how it's pronounced. The word means El Shaddai means God. God is all powerful, omnipotent, but it also means the all sufficient God, the God who will fill your every need. And I think of the hymn, be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. That's the hymn. That's El Shaddai. This title for God, as God tells us on that sheet that you had, God tells us in Exodus 6, verse 2 through 4, that was the name that he chose to reveal himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, by the title of El Shaddai. This title is used 48 times in the Old Testament, and 31 of those times is in the book of Job. Now, if anybody needed it, Job needed it. Anybody who needed to hear that God was sufficient, it was Job. Psalm 91 verse 1 says, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. In the shadow, in the covering of the all-sufficient one, the one who will meet your every need. Now, I don't know about you, but that's where I want to be. So why this new name now? Why did God use this name to reveal himself to Abram now? What do you think? I am all powerful and I am all you need.
Does it have to do something with that letter H?
No.
No? Okay.
Abraham has been walking with his relatives, with his wife, servants, and with his fellow soldiers, and now God is asking him to walk with him. And maybe to leave that old life behind and follow this new life with God.
Right, exactly. I am all you need. You have all of this. You are a very wealthy man, but I am all you need. This all-sufficient, all-powerful one. Well, let me back up. He is the all-powerful and all-sufficient one, and God doesn't need help from anyone. God wanted Abram to know that when the timing is right, God will carry out his plans. You don't have to try to steer apart the car. You don't have to try to do something. You can wait on God. God will carry out his plans when the time is right. And this all-sufficient, this all-powerful one gives Abram 2 commands. The rest of verse 1. He said, walk before me and be blameless. The NIV says, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. First of all, walk before me. Literally what it's saying is, walk before my face. This just came to mind in John 1:1 when it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When it says the Word was with God, that phrase means that they were face to face. They were they were one, they were together face by face. And that's the phrase that's here. Walk before my face. Be with me. Not in my face like we saw with said about Ishmael last time, but be with me, before my face, where I can see you all the time. And that, of course, means more than just putting one foot in front of the other, and more than just walk with me or walk before me or walk before my face. It means a lifestyle. Psalm 1, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. In the New Testament, in Ephesians 4 verse 1, walk in a manner worthy of your calling. And Paul uses that, says pretty much the same thing in Colossians 1, 1 Thessalonians 2. He alludes to it in many other letters. Paul is all about the walk. Joe and I were talking the other day. He was having trouble. His shoe kept coming untied. And I told him, I said, it reminds me of John. John was, I don't know, maybe first grade, kindergarten, first grade. And he kept having trouble. Shoe wouldn't stay tied. And one day he said, I just can't keep my shoe tied. It must have something to do with my walk. And I thought, ooh, that's a lot deeper than you think it is. But it's all about the walk. Not just one step in front of the other, but walking with God, walking in a manner worthy of your calling. And then second, God says, be blameless. The King James Version says, be perfect. But the word perfect or blameless doesn't mean without sin. It doesn't mean you're not going to mess up. The word means to be complete. Walk before me completely. Give it your all. But by the way, that word blameless is the same word that's used in Exodus verse 12 for the unblemished lamb. Unblemished. Completely. It's completely what is needed. Do it completely. Do it with everything you got. And then God says in verse 2, and I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. The NIV says, then I will make my covenant between me and you. But here, the word and or the word then does not appear here. Reading it that way, it sounds like it's a condition.
Yeah.
walk before me and be blameless, and I'll give you my covenant. I'll make my covenant with you. If you do this, I'll do that. But the word and or then is not there. This is a statement that says the walking and being blameless are not conditions, they're commands. What verse 2 literally says is, the end of verse 1, walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you. I will multiply you exceedingly. Do this. You do this. I'm going to do that. Not if you do this or not, but this is your command. Do that. God is saying, I will do this. You can count on it. Now the covenant it already belonged to Abram. He is to walk and live this way because it was already his. God is saying this is how you are to live. Because you are the covenant people, and what he's saying to us, because you are saved, live like this. You don't do this in order to be saved. You don't do this in order to be in the covenant, because you are already in the covenant, because you are already saved. Live like this. As we said a moment ago, walk in a manner worthy of your calling. Live blameless. Live completely in what you know to do. God said, I will. And we've talked about this in several other of the lessons, and I put it in your lesson. How many times God says, I will do something. Watch for that in Scripture. Because it's over and over. I think there's something like 10 or 12 times in this chapter alone that God says, I will do this and I will do that. So God appears and says, Abram, it's time to get out of your routine and get serious about your walk with me. And I think we all reach that point in our lives at some time that we just know it's time to get serious about our walk. Again, these are not conditions. It's an unconditional covenant, but they are commands. Like in chapter 12, verse 2, God says, be a blessing. Not so that you will be a blessing, but be a blessing. Do this. In verse 2, in my translation, God says, I will establish my covenant between me and you. Other translations say, I will make, but it's a different word for make than it is in chapter 15. The word there is not for creating something new. This is the establishment of something, the putting in place of something that has already been made. Now, when we got ready for our chili and tamale supper Friday night, Elaine and I had cooked the chili at home, but we brought it here and put it in place. It was already done. That's this picture. It's already, the covenant has already been done. Now it's time to put it in place. It's time to make it happen, as we might say. It's time for the events to take place. I thought about titling this chapter, This Is It. Now's the time. This is it. In chapter 15, the covenant was cut, and that was the word for make there in chapter 15. Here, it is set in motion. You know, you go to buy a new car. That car may have been made who knows how many months ago, but once you buy it and drive it off the lot, then it's put in motion. Then's the time for it to take place. At just the right time. Now is the time for the covenant to be put in motion. So how does Abram respond? Look at verse 3. And Abram fell on his face. Now, why did he do that?
Respect.
Respect?
Humble himself.
Humble himself?
Just maybe he was just like,
Yeah.
just more than he could handle.
More than he could handle. A little bit of fear mixed in. You know, I mean, I think all of these things. As we were saying, you know, it's been 14 years since he heard from God. He hadn't heard from God since they made that mistake, and Ishmael was born. He may have thought, it's over. I've messed up. This is all it's going to be from now on. And then God says this, and he follows. I mean, it's just like,
I can't do anything else.
I can't do anything else.
Yeah,
It just falls before the Lord in all of those emotions, the fear and the faith and the reverence and all of these things. Of all the things that Abram has experienced, I think he realizes that something different is about to happen now. I mean, he's experienced a lot of things. But God, I'm going to set in motion the covenant. What's that even going to look like? Something's about to happen. The covenant is about to be somehow, he may not even be quite sure, but somehow set in motion now. What could that possibly look like? And then God continued, verses 4 through 6. God said, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram. Let me see if I've got that down here. Okay. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. I will, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful. And I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. The original covenant given to Abram has not been changed. But it has been expanded on. It's been explained and expanded on a little bit and a little bit and a little bit as we've gone along. In chapter 12, Abram was told that God would make him a great nation. Now we see not only nations, plural, were to come from him, but he would be the father of many nations. And kings, plural, would come from him. We know immediately, we know that Israel will come from him. That's one nation, but so will the Edomites, the descendants of Esau. So will the Ishmaelites. So will all the nations that come from his second wife, Keturah. All of these nations will have leaders. They will have kings. And to show everyone that for the here and now, just, you might say, when you walk out the door now, he doesn't have to wait for the future for all these children, nations to develop. I'm going to give you something that will show right now. And he changed his name. Now he's not just exalted father, which is what Abram means. He is the father of a multitude, which is what Abraham means. You know, as Jan mentioned, I made that note in your lesson about the letter that was added to Abram's name. The letter, it's the letter H. And in the Hebrew language, the letter H is the fifth letter in the Hebrew alphabet. You can, if you go to, you don't have to do that now, but in Psalm 119, verse 33, Psalm 119 is divided up by the Hebrew alphabet. And so, verse 33, you come to section number 5, which is the letter H, and it's pronounced hey, like H-A-Y, hey. And I have heard it taught, and I didn't run across this again in my studies this week, so I'm just throwing this out there because I put it in your lesson, but I've heard it taught before that the fifth letter, hey, represents grace. And so God added grace not only to Abram's name, making it Abraham, but also, as we'll see later, to Sarai's name, making it Sarah. I'd already put that in your lesson, so I wanted to explain that. But at any rate, his name is changed, and it is God's grace that did it. A couple of the different commentaries that I was reading this week made mention of the fact that how did Abraham explain to everybody that knew him that his name now is supposed to be Abraham? You know, don't call me Abram anymore. Call me Abraham. They said, look, you still don't have any. You still only have this one child. But that's what God said. So, anyway, one guy said he always thought it was comical to think of Abraham trying to tell everybody, no, don't call me that anymore. Call me this. But anyway, and then God goes on in verses 7 and 8 and says, and I will establish, set it in motion, my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. No, circle that. I was looking for that. For that next, I knew it was in there again, but I was reading over it. An everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. And I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, where you've been right now, all the land of Canaan, again, for an everlasting possession. And I will be their God. That word everlasting in both of those verses, in verse 7 and verse 8, is again that word olam, to the vanishing point. This is an everlasting covenant. It will go on to the vanishing point. I will be their God, all your descendants. And then we come to verse 9. And God says in verse 9, God said further to Abraham, now as for you. Now notice in verse 4, God said, as for me. This, I'm going to do this. I will. All these things that he said from verse 4 down through verse 8. Then we get to verse 9 and God says, now for you. This is going to be your part. This is what you must do. The rest of verse 9. As for you, for the here and now, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. And then in verses 10 through 14, God gives an outward sign that Abraham's descendants were to participate in for the rest of the days of the covenant, which is forever. So let me read this first and then we'll go back and discuss it. Verses 10 through 14. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. It shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in your house, who is bought with money from any foreigner, who is not your descendant. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting, there's that word again, olam, forever, for an everlasting covenant. And then verse 14, but an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. I was doing my reading Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, or Thursday night, Friday night. I couldn't hardly wait till Saturday night to start getting into this part. I really, really wanted to understand it. And I went down rabbit trails and I read, commentaries and I read in all the different things that I could find because I really wanted to understand this. And the commentaries are all over the place on this. Some giving detail as to the why and the wherefore. Others giving very little detail, very little information. And one actually saying that verses 9 through 13 were not suitable for a sermon. I'm like, okay. Honestly, it may be uncomfortable to study this. But it is something that we need to know, especially because it comes up in so many different ways all throughout the Bible, even in the New Testament. Especially if you read chapter 4 of Romans, I mean, it's back and forth and back and forth, the uncircumcised, the uncircumcised. I mean, it is, if you don't know what it means, it is so confusing. So we need to know what it means. It's important. First of all, this is the first mention of circumcision in the Bible. Now, he asked, was this new in Abraham's day? Is this something that they already knew? I have mixed emotions about it, and commentaries differ a little bit about that. Many of the commentaries said that it was not new in Abraham's day, that other nations and other peoples practiced it for sanitary reasons. It said some may have done it as a worship rite of some kind with their god, but because you remember a lot of these false gods that they worship were fertility gods. But it was not common in Mesopotamia, where Abraham was from. It was more common in this area where he came to, in Canaan, in the nations, all these ites, the Hittites and Amorites and all that. But it wasn't common where he came from. So these commentaries that said that God took something that they knew about, they had at least been acquainted with the idea, and gave it new meaning. Just like, this is not the same, but just as an idea, Passover was one thing to the Hebrews in the Old Testament. We view Passover, first fruits particularly, was a feast for the Israelites. We view first fruits as the day of resurrection. So it's the same thing, but given new meaning, that sort of thing. Other commentaries said that Abraham was the first, because, it's the very first everything. It's the first time it's mentioned. But there again, in chapter 14, it's the first mention of war, but we know that's not the first war that ever happened. So, I'm a little, iffy on that. I'm not really sure which it is. One of the commentaries said something about that other nations didn't usually do it until the boy child was 13 years old. And I said, well, that came from this. So, which came from which? So there's two different ways to look at that, and I'm not sure exactly which one. Personally, I lean toward this being the first, but I wouldn't place bets on that. But the word circumcised in this passage is a word that in the tense of it is continuous, means it's always to happen, and it's imperative. It's a command. This is not optional. It is to be done continually. It's a command to be carried out forever. In this case, it wasn't an option. It was an obligation. Now, what I really wanted to know was about the word itself. Because if you read this, you read and it says, let me find the spot. You shall be circumcised. Now, if that's as far as you read, the word itself means circum, means to go around, like circumvent, circumnavigate, to go around. And incis means to cut. So it means to cut around. But cut around what? Could be cut around anything. Until you read the rest of this verse, you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. So were other things cut around at other times, whether physical or, what comes to mind is when Elijah was on Mount Carmel, with all the prophets of Baal and so forth, and they wanted Baal to come and light the offering. They started cutting themselves. Some religions cut themselves. Were there other ways to be cut? I don't know. But I was looking at the word itself. So that is what they are to do. Regardless of what anybody else ever did with any kind of cutting, this is what they were to do. Okay, Why? This was to be, we'll look at verse 11 again. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign. There's the key word in all of this. It shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. The act was to be the sign of the covenant. Being circumcised did not make one a part of the covenant. They were a part of the covenant, therefore they were to be circumcised. They were already a part of the covenant. They were circumcised because they were a part of the covenant. In other words, it's what you do because you're a part of it. J. Vernon McGee said that circumcision is the badge of the covenant. Everyone who came under the covenant, every male, would have this sign in his body. Think about it, every covenant has its own sign. For the Noahic covenant, what's the sign? The rainbow, exactly. For the Mosaic covenant, the sign is the Sabbath day. You shall keep it holy. For the new covenant that Jesus instituted, what's the sign? Communion, exactly. And for the Abrahamic covenant, the sign is communion. Every covenant has a sign, something that's done because you are a part of it. Now, the signs don't save you. They're just a picture of. Abraham's descendants were to obey because of who they were. And all the ones that were in his family came under that umbrella of the covenant. And so that's why they did that. Just like you and I are not saved by our good works. But because we've been saved, Ephesians 2:10 tells us we were created for good works. Because we're saved, this is what we're supposed to do. Because you're in the covenant, this is what you're supposed to do. That doesn't save you. That doesn't make you a part of the covenant. But it's a sign that you are. Ephesians 2:10, we were created for good works that God prepared that we should walk in them. And there's that word walk again. Romans 12:1 tells us that that's our reasonable service. That's our logical service. This is what you do. I mean, Joe and I have this phrase and we use it all the time. We said it to Chris. We say it here at church. It's what we do. We do these things because this is what we do. It's our reasonable service. But again, I kept going, why this particular sign? That's what I wanted to know. Today, as I said, it's done for sanitary reasons. That was not particularly the case then. It may have been, but I think it was primarily these fertility rites with all these other gods. So there must be a deeper reason for it. And I wanted to know that. One commentary said that this whole chapter reads like a page out of Leviticus. I thought, yeah, that's about right. But Henry Morris, in his commentary, said that circumcision was commanded strictly as a sign of the covenant. Therefore, it must symbolize in some way the purpose and the results of the Abrahamic covenant. It had to have something to do with it. I mean, the rainbow is because of the flood. That's why that is. Communion is because of the bread and the cup. That's why that is. So there's got to be something about this that has something to do with the covenant. I kept digging. Morris went on and said that the ultimate emphasis of the covenant is on the one to come, the Messiah. That's the covenant. The Messiah, the seed of the woman, is going to come. That's the bottom line. That's what saved Abraham. He believed God. That is what the covenant is all about. The one that is to come, the seed of the woman. Therefore, it's got to have something to do with reproduction. And this too is a blood covenant, just like Sherry said earlier. To do this, there is blood, there is pain. But you'll notice, and you probably already know this, I sort of knew it, but I researched it to get the details because this is so cool. God said to do every male among you who is 8 days old. You'll notice it's done on the 8th day. That is the day, according to medical science, that the clotting factor in a baby reaches its highest point. Today, according to my pediatric nurse friend Jody Lusby, today vitamin K is given at birth to accelerate the clotting factor. They don't keep you in the hospital 8 days anymore. It was done on the 8th day because naturally, in male, female, in every baby's body, the vitamin K begins to be produced and reaches its highest level on the 8th day. On the 9th day, it goes back down a little, but it's at its highest point on the 8th day. But God already knew that. I just think that's the coolest thing. But the covenant had to be cut. There had to be blood. God ratified the covenant in chapter 15 using that picture and actually cutting the animals. And here circumcision is just as real, but it's a representative. Chapter 15, it was a representative of God taking full responsibility for the covenant because God alone walked through those. Here, although it's a real event, it is a picture of, a sign of, you are a part of that covenant. But why? Why the foreskin of the male? Because that's where the seed comes from. Andy Wood said this is just a ritual, but there is a reality behind it. Just like communion is a ritual, but there is a reality behind it. The bread represents Christ's body. The cup represents His blood. There is a reality behind the ritual that we do. This is a ritual, but there is a reality behind it. It was God who decreed that seed would be transmitted and that children would be created this way, this very intimate way. Remember when we were talking about creation? We said, God could have done this, and He could have done that, and He could have done that. God could have done creation in a multitude of ways, but He chose to do it in the way that He did. God could have had decreed that babies would come, new life would come about in any way He wanted. But this is what He decreed. He did it the way He chose. And there is nothing more sacred than the creation of a life. And this is the way God chose for it to happen. So this intimate sign, this what they're doing, think about it. This circumcision is only seen by the parents of the child himself, and then later his wife. It's all that's going to see this on a normal basis. And this would be a daily testimony, a daily sign that he and his family are a part of the Abrahamic Covenant. There is a scripture that I believe gives us an example of a time when it was shared with someone else. And many scholars believe, you remember the story of Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery. All Israelites, men, had beards. Sold Joseph into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. Egyptians are smooth skinned. They shave. So Joseph was shaved, of course. Remember, the brothers came down after the famine. They didn't know who he was. And he would go off to himself and cry and then come back out. Didn't let him know who he was through the whole thing. Kept Benjamin. The whole story behind that. But then there comes a point when he tells them who he is. And they don't believe him. And he takes them off privately. And Scripture doesn't tell us what he does. But I believe he shows them his circumcision. And here's the thing about that. Let me find my place. I got off there. After the law was given, the priest did the circumcision. Jesus was taken to the temple, it said, for their purification rites, and he was circumcised on the 8th day. But before that, before there were priests, before there was the law, the patriarch of the family did it. So all of the other brothers would have been circumcised in the same way that Joseph was. Every patriarch would have had his own style. That's just...
Sorry, I'm getting a visual.
And we're recording that, But that was such an intimate thing that it was for your own family. Now, there's one more thing we need to think about here. For the Israelites, this goes to what Linda mentioned earlier. Remember, Moses is writing all this down? And you've got all these Israelites maybe hearing about this for the first time. There's a problem.
Yeah.
The Israelites weren't circumcised during that 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And they're like, uh-oh. That would come en masse once they crossed the Jordan River at a place called Gilgal, which the word means the place of the rolling away of the reproach. It's in Joshua 5. There are many other times the word circumcision is used in the Bible. Deuteronomy 10:6, Jeremiah 4:4 speak of circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Romans 4, Colossians 2, many other places. That would make a great study itself. We just don't have time to dig into that. But what it boils down to is something that you do that leads to your belief of who you are. In Jeremiah and in Deuteronomy, it says your heart is hardened. You need to remove from your heart the covering that is over it so that you can see, so that you can believe. So, does that explain that? It helped me what I found and what I learned from it. Do we have questions? Remember, we're live streaming, but we can have questions after.
Well, in verse 13, kind of makes sense to me. It says, your bodies will thus bear the mark of my everlasting covenant.
Right.
That they're bearing the mark.
They're bearing the mark of the covenant. The question comes up, particularly in, you want to look this up later, or if we have time, Colossians 2, verses 9 through 12. The Judaizers, you remember, in the New Testament, when Paul was on his missionary journeys, the Judaizers believed that for a Gentile to become a Christian, they had to first become a Jew, which means that men had to be circumcised. And, Acts chapter 15, they have the Jerusalem Council, and that answers all of that. But Colossians 2, verse 9 through 12 is probably one of the clearest scriptures to explain why the Gentiles did not need to be. Jesus has already taken away from us the body, quote, body of sin. The body of flesh has already been taken away from us, so we don't need to do that. And again, the church, remember, the church is like a parenthesis in God's, I don't like to use the word dispensation, but in God's economy, in God's history. Daniel, it talks about the 70 weeks. 69 weeks have already been fulfilled. We still have that 70th week, which will be the tribulation. The church age is that parenthesis that takes place between the 69th week and 70th week. In that, we live under grace, and we live in the church era where Jesus has taken away the reproach. We don't need to be in the Abrahamic Covenant. We're grafted in, and I don't want to get into that's a whole other teaching from Romans, but Jesus has taken away our reproaches. Basically, the bottom line of that.
I guess what really explained circumcision to me was your extra chapters to take a look at. Because, in Deuteronomy, it talks about circumcise your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I took as circumcision, the actual act, is just the outward sign.
Exactly.
Where the circumcision that is performed by God is with your heart.
Oh yeah, great. That's a great way to put that. Yeah, that I should have used that. We talk about baptism being an outward sign of an inward change.
Right.
Circumcision is just that outward visual of what has happened within them. Yeah, great.
And cutting off of the flesh. You got to take a look at Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac is the son of promise, where Ishmael is the son of flesh.
Yeah, but Ishmael was still circumcised.
And he was still circumcised, but basically what it's saying is, that was the wrong thing for Abraham to do, and this is how we're going to. Yeah. Well, that's how it explained it to me.
Yeah, great.
Ishmael was of flesh.
Yeah, and I forget which scripture that was that Paul goes, he says, this is the analogy, Ishmael and Hagar is of the law because it's works of the flesh, and Isaac is of the promise of God. So, yeah, great. Any other thoughts?
Well, thank you for adding those in, because otherwise I was confused.
Well, I just try to find, when I write those up, I'm just looking for stuff to throw in, and I'm glad that helped on that.
It did.
All right. Anything else? Okay. So I'm going to go through the rest of this pretty quickly because it's pretty straightforward. I'm sure if this was all we were going to study, I would have found a lot more to say about it. But so we'll just go through this kind of quickly. So begin at verse 15 then. Then God said to Abraham, now, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah, the H, shall be added to her name. So God is saying she is a part of this covenant, just as you are. And I will bless her. And indeed, just get this through your head, Abraham. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. God Almighty, all sufficient, all powerful. I can do anything. Then I will bless her. She will receive the same blessing that Abraham does. She shall be the mother of nations. Kings and people shall come from her. And then it says, then Abraham fell on his face again and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old, and will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Now, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. Did he do that out of a disbelief, just like we talked about last time, the difference between Zacharias and Mary? You don't know sometimes until you see the results of it. On first reading, we would think he's mocking God or he's laughing at God. But no, as you go on, you see that it's a joyful laughter. But then the reality comes to him, wait. There's Ishmael. I don't believe, verse 18, and Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. I don't believe that Abraham is misunderstanding God. Because God just said it's going to come from the child, going to have a son by her, through Sarah. I believe that Abraham has come to love Ishmael, that he doesn't want Ishmael left out. And he said, oh, that Ishmael might live before they. Remember, he probably knows that prophecy that was made about Ishmael. He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. He's going to be against all his brothers. He's going to be the aggressor. Oh, please, Lord, let Ishmael live before you too. But God said no. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Name's given even before she conceives. And here again, I will establish, I will set in motion my covenant with him for an everlasting, for an olam, to the vanishing point covenant for his descendants after him. But don't worry about Ishmael. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him. God doesn't say he's going to bless him back when he tells Hagar about him. But now he does. I will bless him. And then God uses the same words that he uses in Genesis 1. I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, as we read that in chapter 25, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant, verse 21, my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season, at this time next year. And when God had finished talking with Abraham, God went up from Abraham. And we don't know exactly how he appeared to him as God Almighty, but however he left, whether it was a ascension or just, well, we don't know, but he went up from Abraham. And I have to wonder there if Abraham shared this with Sarah. Because she does, and we get to chapter 18, she doesn't seem to know that this is going to happen. So I'm anxious to study chapter 18 now and see. But then verse 23, and Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the servants who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day as God had said to him. Not only did he obeyed immediately. And then it says, now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And many traditional Arabs still circumcise their sons at age 13 because Ishmael was.
Who circumcised Abraham?
That's what I was going to ask that question.
I don't know. Apparently, I don't know. Did he do it himself? I mean,
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think he probably did, but I'm not going to go down that road.
That's not part of the story.
That's not part of the story. That's exactly right. Thank you for rescuing me from that.
But you know, Abraham's he's got a name and a date now.
Yeah.
So it's going to happen.
Yeah. And all the men of his household who were born in his house are bought with money. And it repeats this again. That's what perplexes me about this chapter is how many times these same things were repeated. All the men born in his household who were all the men of his household who were born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner were circumcised with him. So you're right. So we got a date. So we know within the next year. And so we get to chapter 18 and the Lord appears to him and tells him, that Sarah is going to have a child. And it's got to have something to do with the wording, because in verse 10 of chapter 18 it says, God says to him, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. So, reads to me like at that point she wasn't pregnant yet, but at this time next year she will already have the son. Maybe, if it's a year, the son will be 3 months old by the time he comes back. I don't know. I haven't read that far ahead in the story yet. So, but anyway,
he had to be circumcised because it was part of the covenant, and probably he had to have the circumcision before a child could be born.
Yeah, because Ishmael is born before he is.
Right.
And he's a son of the flesh, just like Kay said. But now Isaac is a son of the covenant, the son that comes through the sign of the covenant.
Right.
All right. Questions, thoughts? We can turn the camera off if you want. Let me turn the camera off. Joe, cut the feed off. We're going to finish up. For those who watch it online, so you ought to show up at the...
Well, they can't.
Okay.
Cut